The Celestial Institute of Advanced Species Studies occupied a space station so monumentally excessive in its architecture that it could only have been designed by a committee of 17 different species who couldn't agree on what aesthetically pleasing meant. The result was a floating academic monstrosity that somehow combined crystalline spires, bioluminescent domes, and what appeared to be several buildings that existed in 4 dimensions simultaneously. It hung in the void like a pretentious chandelier, broadcasting its importance to anyone within 3 star systems who had the misfortune of possessing eyes. For the past 4 centuries, the Institute had served as the premier educational facility for the galaxy's best and brightest, which really meant it was where wealthy families sent their spawn to obtain expensive credentials, while networking with other spawn of wealthy families. The student body represented over 200 species from across 7 galactic sectors, each one allegedly more advanced and civilized than the last. They studied everything from quantum displacement theory to comparative xenobiology, all while pretending that the university cafeteria's attempts at multi-species cuisine weren't a war crime against taste buds of every physiological configuration. The Institute prided itself on accepting only species that had achieved what the galactic community diplomatically termed appropriate developmental benchmarks. This was bureaucratic speak for having invented faster-than-light travel, established democratic governance, and most importantly, figured out how to kill each other with sufficient efficiency that everyone agreed to stop doing it quite so enthusiastically. It was civilization measured in treaties signed and weapons capable of planetary destruction that gathered dust in museums. Kelvix of Thornia adjusted his refraction matrix, which was what crystalline species did instead of straightening their collars, and surveyed his fellow students with barely concealed superiority. He was, by his own estimation, and that of absolutely no one else, the finest scholar his generation had produced. His people, the Thornians, had evolved on a world of silicon-based formations, where the greatest danger was occasional seismic activity and the rare dust storm. They had transcended violence approximately 3,000 years ago, developed philosophical frameworks that made ancient Earth thinkers look like children arguing over toys, and had erected monuments to intellectualism that could be seen from orbital space. In short, Kelvix considered himself and his species the very definition of civilized, and he wasn't shy about reminding everyone else of this fact approximately every 12 minutes. The classroom itself was a marvel of unnecessary technology. Holographic displays floated at angles that seemed to defy spatial geometry. Desks adjusted automatically to accommodate everything from methane-breathing squid analogs to species whose entire bodies existed as dispersed quantum probabilities. The professor, a Vendarian whose tendrils shifted through colors that indicated mood in ways that would take a human linguist 40 years to fully decode, was preparing the day's lesson on comparative survival biology. This was where things had gotten interesting lately. And by interesting, one meant the kind of interesting that made half the faculty nervous, and the other half fascinated in the way scientists get fascinated when they discover something that probably shouldn't exist, but does anyway. 3 weeks ago, the Institute had admitted its first student from Earth. The decision had caused a bureaucratic meltdown of spectacular proportions. Earth, that little blue marble tucked away in an unfashionable arm of the Milky Way, had only achieved interstellar capability within the last decade. They were newcomers, primitives by galactic standards, barely crawling out of their single-system cradle. The fact that they'd been fast-tracked into galactic society at all was controversial enough. The fact that one of them was now sitting in a classroom with species that had been spacefaring when humans were still figuring out agriculture had caused at least 7 formal protests and 1 minor diplomatic incident. But here she was anyway, sitting 3 rows back, looking thoroughly unbothered by the fact that she was surrounded by aliens who regarded her species with emotions ranging from curiosity to condescension. Kelvix had researched Earth, naturally. It was what superior intellects did when faced with the unknown. What he'd discovered had only reinforced his initial assessment. Humans were remarkably unremarkable. Their planet was classified as a Class 7 habitability zone, which meant it was survivable but somewhat challenging. They had moderately high gravity, a bit more radiation than ideal, and weather patterns that occasionally became inconvenient. Their evolutionary path had involved some competition for resources and predation, but nothing exceptional. They were, in Kelvix's learned opinion, a species that had gotten lucky rather than one that had earned their place among the stars. The human student he hadn't bothered learning her name, seeing no need to memorize what would likely be a short-lived academic experiment, appeared to be female by human standards. She had tied her dark hair back in a simple configuration, wore the standard institute uniform with modifications for her bipedal structure, and was currently examining her datapad with an expression of what looked like mild amusement. This irritated Kelvix more than it should have. She should be intimidated. She should be desperately trying to prove herself worthy of being here. Instead, she looked like someone waiting for a mildly entertaining show to begin. The professor's tendrils flashed a shade of pedagogical enthusiasm. Today's discussion focuses on adaptive strategies for surviving hostile environments. We will examine how different species have evolved mechanisms to overcome planetary challenges. Kelvix's crystalline structure brightened, which was the Thornian equivalent of sitting up straighter. This was his specialty. He had written extensively on evolutionary efficiency, arguing that truly advanced species transcended their violent origins to embrace intellectual pursuits. The Granthi of Sector 9, the professor continued, pulling up a holographic display, evolved in methane seas with pressure that would crush most carbon-based life forms. Their civilization developed pressure-resistant architecture and biotechnology to expand beyond their crushing depths. Several students murmured appreciation. The Granthi were considered one of the more impressive success stories of adaptation through intelligence. The Colathi, another display appeared, emerged from a world with gravity 3 times galactic standard. Their solution was gravitational manipulation technology developed at the molecular level. More appreciative murmurs. Everyone loved a good story about species overcoming odds through cleverness rather than violence. Kelvix couldn't resist. His voice, which resonated through his crystalline structure in frequencies that translators rendered as insufferably smug, filled the classroom. Professor, if I may observe, these examples demonstrate the superiority of intellectual adaptation over primitive survival instincts. Species that transcend violence inevitably achieve greater civilization. Several students nodded. This was conventional wisdom among the galactic community, the kind of thing everyone agreed on because it made them feel sophisticated. The professor's tendrils flickered in a color that suggested diplomatic discomfort. An interesting perspective, Kelvix, though perhaps somewhat simplified. Is it though? Kelvix was on a roll now, his brilliance surely dazzling everyone present. Consider that the most advanced species, in this very classroom, come from worlds where existential danger was minimized early in evolutionary development. Violence is a primitive solution. Intelligence is the hallmark of true advancement. He absolutely did not look at the human student when he said this. That would have been too obvious. But the implication hung in the air like a particularly aggressive cologne. The human, whose name was actually Rena Vasquez though Kelvix still hadn't bothered to learn it, looked up from her datapad. Her expression hadn't changed from that mild amusement, which somehow made what she said next infinitely more dangerous. You know, that's a really pretty theory. Her voice was calm, measured, and carried an undertone that made several predator species students instinctively lean forward. Real delicate. Like glass. The translator rendered her words in standard galactic, but something in her tone transcended translation protocols. Kelvix's structure flickered, with what might have been irritation or might have been the crystalline equivalent of a nervous laugh. I'm sorry, are you suggesting that violence has somehow contributed to advancement? Your species only achieved interstellar flight through the application of principles discovered by peaceful research. Sure, Rena agreed easily, which threw Kelvix off balance because he'd expected argument. We did use peaceful research. Right after we finished using the same rocket technology to see how efficiently we could deliver explosives to other continents. See, we're good at multitasking like that. A Vendarian student in the front row made a strangled sound through their tendrils. That's exactly my point. Kelvix pressed forward, sensing weakness. Your species' violent tendencies held back your development. Imagine how much faster you would have progressed if you'd embraced intellectual pursuits instead of primitive conflict. Rena's smile was the kind of smile that made experienced soldiers on 100 worlds take a step backward without knowing why. You know what? You're probably right. We should test that theory. What do you say we run a practical demonstration? The professor's tendrils went through approximately 7 colors in rapid succession, none of them good. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's an excellent idea. Kelvix interrupted, his academic pride now thoroughly engaged and his common sense having apparently left for an extended vacation. A practical demonstration would conclusively prove that intellectual preparation surpasses primitive survival instincts. Great. Rena stood up, and her movement had an economy to it that several of the more observant predator species students recognized and respected. The Institute has those survival simulation chambers, right? We could run a scenario, see who comes out ahead. Your intellectual superiority versus my primitive instincts. The professor tried again, tendrils now flashing colors that roughly translated to "Please don't make me file incident reports." Perhaps we should discuss this theoretically. Where's the learning in that? Rena's grin widened. Come on, Professor. Isn't hands-on education your whole thing here? Kelvix, who had exactly 0 survival skills and absolute confidence in his non-existent survival skills, agreed immediately. I accept your challenge. We'll settle this scientifically. The classroom erupted in murmurs. A creche predator species student in the back made a sound that her translator rendered as "Oh, this is going to be good," while a peaceful herbivore analog from the Gentle Collective started pulling up the Institute's emergency medical services on his datapad. The professor, recognizing a lost cause when he saw one, flickered through colors of resignation. Very well, but this will be supervised, recorded, and conducted under strict safety protocols. And you'll both need to sign liability waivers. Obviously, Rena said cheerfully. Acceptable. Kelvix agreed, his structure practically glowing with confidence. Approximately 20 minutes later, both students stood before the entrance to the Institute's holographic environmental survival chamber, which was typically used for training exercises and academic research, not for students to engage in what was essentially a very expensive, very supervised fight using environmental hazards as weapons. The chamber could simulate virtually any environment in the known galaxy, from the methane storms of Granthur to the crushing depths of oceanic worlds. It was considered one of the Institute's most valuable educational tools, which was why there were approximately 17 safety officers currently having a collective anxiety attack while processing the paperwork. A crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the student body with a kind of speed usually reserved for gossip about romantic entanglements and cafeteria food poisoning incidents. Apparently, everyone wanted to see the crystalline intellectual face off against the Deathworld primitive. The head safety officer, Amranthi, whose entire species had evolved in padded environments and considered papercuts a major medical emergency, read through the liability waiver with tendrils that shook slightly. You understand that the simulation will include genuine physical danger, environmental hazards, and potentially hostile fauna. Yes, both students said simultaneously. And you understand that while the chamber includes safety overrides and medical intervention protocols, there is still a non-zero chance of injury. Yes. The safety officer looked at them both like they were insane, which was fair. And you're certain you want to proceed? Absolutely, Kelvix said, his structure radiating certainty. Wouldn't miss it, Renner agreed. The safety officer made a sound that translators struggled to render, finally settling on deeply resigned acceptance of administrative inevitability. Very well. The simulation parameters will be set to Class 7 environmental challenges with moderate predatory fauna. The scenario will last 30 standard minutes or until both participants signal completion. You will each have access to basic survival equipment and tools. Make it Class 9, Rena said casually. Everyone stopped. Class 9 environments were classified as extremely hostile to most known life. They were the kind of places that required advanced technology just to survive, let alone thrive. They were Deathworlds. Kelvix's structure flickered, and then, because his pride was apparently a terminal condition, he straightened. Class 9 is acceptable. I'm confident my intellectual approach will prove superior regardless of environmental severity. The safety officer looked at the professor. The professor looked at the ceiling, tendrils cycling through colors that probably meant he was mentally updating his resume. Several students in the crowd started taking bets. Class 9, it is. The safety officer finally said, sounding like someone signing their own performance review with a failure grade. May the universe have mercy on my employment record. The chamber doors opened, revealing a space that looked deceptively empty, all white surfaces and holographic emitters. Both students entered, taking positions on opposite sides of the chamber. Through the observation windows, what looked like half the student body, and at least a quarter of the faculty, had assembled to watch. The professor's voice came through the chamber's communication system. The simulation will begin in 30 seconds. Your objective is survival and environmental adaptation. Are both participants ready? Ready, Kelvix confirmed, his structure already analyzing the space and calculating optimal strategies. Born ready, Rena said, which the translator struggled with before settling on perpetually prepared for adversarial circumstances. The countdown began. Kelvix ran through his mental preparations. He had studied extreme environment protocols extensively. The key was systematic analysis, careful resource management, and methodical application of available technology. He had brought a standard survival kit that included a quantum blade for cutting, a portable shelter generator, and atmospheric filters. All very advanced, very civilized tools that demonstrated technological superiority. Rena stood relaxed, rolling her shoulders, looking like someone about to go for a light jog rather than enter a Deathworld simulation. Her survival kit looked nearly identical to Kelvix's because the Institute issued standard equipment. The countdown reached 0. Reality shifted. The white chamber dissolved into something that would have given environmental engineers nightmares. The temperature immediately spiked to what felt like standing inside a star's corona, while simultaneously, the atmospheric composition registered as barely breathable and mildly corrosive. The ground beneath them transformed into jagged volcanic rock that radiated heat through multiple spectrum ranges. The sky, if you could call it that, roiled with clouds that occasionally discharged what looked like lightning, but registered on scanners as something far worse: ionized plasma storms that could fry electronic equipment and organic tissue with equal enthusiasm. Welcome to a Class 9 Deathworld simulation, where the environment itself was actively trying to kill you and the local fauna hadn't even shown up yet to make things interesting. Kelvix immediately activated his portable shelter generator, creating a small atmospheric bubble around himself. The device hummed efficiently, filtering out the worst of the toxic atmosphere and regulating temperature. This was exactly what intellectual preparation looked like: anticipating problems and solving them with technology. He glanced across the hellscape toward where the human had been standing, expecting to see her scrambling with her own survival equipment, probably regretting her bravado. Instead, he saw her taking off her jacket, just taking it off, calmly. Like the temperature that would have boiled most species' internal fluids was mildly warm rather than instantly lethal. She tied the jacket around her waist, rolled up her sleeves, and looked around the volcanic nightmare with the expression of someone checking out a new neighborhood. You should activate your shelter generator, Kelvix called out through his communicator, his voice carrying what he believed was helpful concern and what actually sounded like condescension. The atmospheric conditions are dangerous. Rena glanced at the device on her belt, then at the sky, then back at Kelvix. Nah, I'm good. This is basically like Arizona in July. Maybe a bit spicy with the sulfur content, but nothing I can't handle. Before Kelvix could process this response, the ground trembled. Cracks appeared in the volcanic rock, and from those cracks emerged the simulation's idea of hostile fauna. They looked like someone had taken a scorpion, made it the size of a bear, added extra claws, gave it acid for blood, and then asked it politely if it wouldn't mind being even more terrifying. About 6 of them erupted from the ground, their chitinous armor reflecting the plasma storm light in deeply unpleasant ways. The creatures immediately identified 2 sources of potential food and began their approach with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested they were very good at being giant murderous scorpion things. Kelvix activated his quantum blade, which hummed to life with technology that could cut through most known materials. He positioned himself defensively inside his shelter bubble, calculating attack angles and defensive positions. This was manageable. These creatures operated on instinct. He could outsmart them. 3 of the creatures turned toward him, analyzing his shelter bubble with sensory organs that existed in spectrums he couldn't see. They began probing it with their claws, testing for weaknesses. The other 3 went for Rena. What happened next would be discussed in the cafeteria for weeks afterward, and would require the combat analysis professor to completely revise his understanding of human kinetic capabilities. The first creature lunged with its stinger, moving with speed that should have been impossible for something that massive. Rena sidestepped with about an inch to spare, grabbed the stinger mid-thrust, and used the creature's own momentum to flip it onto its back. While it was still trying to comprehend how physics had betrayed it so thoroughly, she brought her boot down on what appeared to be a weak point in its armor with enough force that the simulation's structural integrity sensors registered significant damage. The creature stopped moving, not dead but definitely reconsidering its life choices. The second creature tried a different approach, going low and fast. Rena jumped, which wasn't remarkable. What was remarkable was that she jumped onto the creature's back, rode it like some kind of nightmarish rodeo attraction for approximately 3 seconds while it thrashed, then drove her quantum blade through the gap where its head connected to its thorax with the precision of someone who had done this exact thing before, with different deadly creatures. The third creature, showing more intelligence than its companions, actually paused to reassess. This moment of hesitation was a mistake. Rena pulled a rock, just a rock, nothing technological about it, literally a chunk of volcanic stone, and threw it with enough velocity that it registered on the chamber's kinetic sensors as a projectile weapon. The rock struck the creature's sensory cluster and caused it to recoil, at which point Rena closed the distance and finished it with her blade. Total elapsed time, approximately 45 seconds. Rena looked at the 3 disabled creatures, then at Kelvix, then at her surroundings. So, is there more, or was that the warm-up? Through the observation window, approximately 30 students were completely silent. A creche predator species, whose people had evolved hunting in packs through dangerous forests, slowly nodded with something like professional respect. A peaceful herbivore species student had fainted. Kelvix, still inside his shelter bubble, was dealing with his own 3 creatures. They had discovered that attacking the bubble directly was ineffective, so they'd begun trying to dig underneath it. This was problematic. He couldn't maintain the bubble indefinitely. The power cell had limits. He couldn't fight all 3 creatures simultaneously with his quantum blade because despite his intellectual superiority, he had the combat experience of someone who had grown up on a world where the greatest physical danger was tripping over philosophical tablets. "I suggest using the terrain," Rena called out helpfully while casually avoiding a new creature that had emerged from the ground behind her. She dispatched it with an efficiency that was becoming disturbing. "Those lava flows over there?" The simulation made them interactive. You could potentially lead the creatures into environmental hazards instead of engaging directly. It was good advice. It was tactically sound advice. It was advice that came from someone who was treating a Class 9 Deathworld simulation like a casual hike while offering tips to the person who had challenged her intellectual superiority. Kelvix's structure flickered through colors that indicated complex emotional states, including frustration, embarrassment, and a growing horrified realization. He attempted to implement Rena's strategy, deactivating his bubble and running toward the lava flows. The creatures followed, which was according to plan. What wasn't according to plan was that running across volcanic terrain required physical capabilities he simply didn't possess. His crystalline structure, evolved for philosophical contemplation rather than fleeing from acid-blooded scorpion monsters, wasn't particularly suited for sprint work. He tripped. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make a good story, but in the very mundane way that people who don't regularly run across volcanic hellscapes tend to trip when attempting to run across volcanic hellscapes. The creatures closed in. And then Rena was there, somehow having crossed 50 meters of deadly terrain in approximately the time it took Kelvix to fall down, positioning herself between him and the creatures. Her quantum blade moved in patterns that weren't random flailing but weren't formal combat training either. They were efficient, brutal, and utterly practical. 2 creatures went down before they realized they were in a fight. The third managed to score a hit on Rena's arm, its claw tearing through the uniform fabric and drawing blood. She didn't scream, didn't panic, just looked at the wound, then at the creature, and her expression shifted to something that made the creature a simulation of an apex predator on a Deathworld actually back up. "Okay," she said quietly. "Now I'm annoyed." What followed was less like a fight and more like a physics demonstration on the transfer of kinetic energy through biological materials. The creature, despite being larger, stronger, and possessing natural weapons that could punch through most known armor, found itself systematically dismantled by a human who had apparently decided that getting injured had transformed this from a teaching moment into something personal. The simulation recognized the threat level had been neutralized and began shutting down the hostile fauna protocol. The environmental hazards remained, but the creatures dissolved back into pixels and programming. Rena stood in the middle of the volcanic hellscape, bleeding from one arm, breathing slightly harder than when she started, and looking around with an expression that suggested mild disappointment that the entertainment had ended. Kelvix, still on the ground where he'd fallen, stared at her with his crystalline structure cycling through colors that indicated complete cognitive recalibration of previously held beliefs. "You should probably activate your medical kit for that cut," he managed to say, his voice lacking all traces of his earlier condescension. Rena glanced at her arm like she'd forgotten about it. "What this? This is nothing. You should see what our cats can do." "Actually, no, you really shouldn't. That's legitimately terrifying." She walked over and offered Kelvix a hand to help him up. He took it, letting this Deathworld primitive, who had just treated a Class 9 simulation like a minor inconvenience, pull him to his feet. "Your planet," he said slowly, his translator struggling to render the complex harmonics of his confusion. "You said this was like camping?" "Well, some parts of Earth, yeah." Rena shrugged, which was apparently what humans did when discussing their nightmarish homeworld. "I mean, we have deserts with extreme heat, jungles with humidity that'll kill you. Both poles have sub-zero temperatures. Our oceans have pressure zones that'll crush you flat. And our wildlife includes everything from apex predators to microscopic organisms that can drop you in hours. Plus, natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. And don't get me started on the plants. We have plants with toxins that can kill you by touch." She said all of this with the casual tone of someone describing a mildly quirky hometown. Kelvix's structure had gone very, very still. "Your planet is classified as a Class 7 habitability zone." "Yeah, I saw that in the database." Rena's expression suggested she found this amusing. "I think whoever did that assessment maybe visited the nice parts and didn't, check everywhere else. Or maybe they came during spring, which is lovely if you ignore the tornado season and the flooding and the..." "How?" Kelvix interrupted, his voice cycling through frequencies that indicated existential crisis. "Has your species survived?" Rena considered this question with the gravity it deserved. "Spite, mostly. We're really, really good at spite. Also adaptation, tool-making, pattern recognition, endurance hunting, and this thing we do where when something tries to kill us, we figure out how to kill it back and then sometimes domesticate it and keep it as a pet." Through the observation window, the professor was having a very animated conversation with the safety officers, his tendrils flashing through colors that probably indicated he was explaining that technically, everything had gone according to protocol, and no students had died, so really this was a successful educational exercise. The simulation environment began to dissolve. the volcanic hellscape fading back to white walls and holographic emitters. Both students stood in the now empty chamber, one bleeding and unbothered, the other uninjured and experiencing what could only be described as a comprehensive reevaluation of his understanding of civilization. "I must apologize," Kelvix said finally, his structure dimming in what was the Thornian equivalent of humility. "I made assumptions based on incomplete data and cultural prejudice. Your species' survival strategies are not primitive, they are sophisticated responses to an environment that would have exterminated my people in approximately 3 generations. Rena waved this off. "Hey, no worries. You're not the first alien to look at Earth stats and think we're exaggerating. Though usually they figure it out when they visit and realize that our weather can kill you. Our animals can kill you. Our plants can kill you. And sometimes the ground just opens up and swallows things because plate tectonics are fun like that." "How do you sleep?" Kelvix asked, genuinely bewildered, "knowing you live in such conditions." "Usually pretty well, actually. We got used to it. Besides, once you've dealt with Earth, most other places seem pretty manageable. Your world sounds really peaceful, though. That must be nice." There was no condescension in her voice, just genuine observation. This somehow made it worse. The chamber doors opened, and they were immediately swarmed by safety officers doing medical scans, professors wanting to review the simulation data, and students who were looking at Rena with expressions ranging from awe to terror to, in the case of the Kresh predator species students, something that looked like they just found their new favorite person. The medical scan showed that Rena's injury was minor. The creature's claw had scored her arm but hadn't done any serious damage. The medical officer, who was from a species that considered bruises a major trauma, kept scanning the wound like it couldn't possibly be as minor as the readings indicated. "Friend, you're certain you don't require pain management?" The medical officer asked for the 3rd time. "I'm good. Got some antiseptic? That sulfur content might cause infection otherwise." The medical officer provided antiseptic with trembling appendages, while muttering something about Deathworld physiology being a regulatory nightmare. The professor approached both students, his tendrils cycling through colors that indicated complex emotions. "That was educational. Highly irregular. Absolutely going to generate paperwork that will haunt me for years, but educational." "Did I pass?" Rena asked with a grin. "You both passed, though in very different ways. Kelvix, you demonstrated the limitations of purely theoretical preparation. Rena, you demonstrated why certain species classifications may require revision and why the Galactic Council has been having very serious discussions about Earth's actual danger rating." "Wait," Kelvix said, his structure brightening with realization. "Earth isn't actually a Class 7 world." The professor's tendrils flickered in a color that suggested uncomfortable truths. "Earth is classified as Class 7 for diplomatic reasons. The actual assessment, accounting for all environmental factors, biological hazards, and geological instability, places it somewhere between Class 9 and Class 11. Several students in earshot made strangled sounds. Class 11 worlds were classified as unsurvivable without extensive technological intervention, and even then maybe not. But we live there, Rena pointed out reasonably. Like billions of us, with cities and farms and everything. "Yes," the professor said, tendrils cycling through colors that indicated the universe was full of terrifying mysteries. "You do. This is why the Galactic Council has been having anxiety attacks since first contact." Kelvix turned to Rena, his structure pulsing with colors that indicated newfound respect mixed with healthy fear. "I owe you an apology beyond my earlier one. I judged your entire species based on assumptions that were not just wrong, but catastrophically incorrect. Your survival strategies aren't primitive, they're the result of evolutionary pressures that would have eliminated most species entirely." "Thanks, I think." Renner accepted this with good humor. "For what it's worth, your philosophical approach would probably work great on a lot of worlds. Just maybe not the ones actively trying to murder their inhabitants. Our entire civilization is built on avoiding conflict through intellectual discourse," Kelvix said slowly. working through implications. Because our world never required us to develop significant survival capabilities. We had the luxury of evolving toward pure intellectualism because our environment permitted it. That sounds really nice, actually, Rena said sincerely. Must be peaceful. It is. But perhaps peace is easier when the planet isn't constantly challenging your right to exist. This observation hung in the air with the weight of genuine philosophical insight, which was impressive considering it was happening in a simulation chamber while medical officers treated a minor wound from a holographic Deathworld scorpion monster. The crowd of students began dispersing, though many were clearly going to head straight to the cafeteria to spread the story. The Kresh predator species students stopped to talk to Rena, engaging in what appeared to be an animated discussion about hunting techniques and combat efficiency. Kelvix watched this and realized something that felt like intellectual growth mixed with humility, which was a new and not entirely comfortable sensation. The galaxy's understanding of civilization was built on the experiences of species that had evolved on relatively gentle worlds. They had created frameworks and philosophies about advancement and sophistication based on their own paths. But Earth, chaotic, deadly, beautiful Earth had produced a species that achieved civilization not by transcending violence, but by surviving it, adapting to it, and eventually building peace, despite their environment, rather than because of it. That wasn't primitive. That was terrifying and impressive in equal measure. Later, much later, after incident reports had been filed and medical clearances issued, and at least 3 professors had updated their lecture materials to include footnotes about Deathworld survival strategies, Kelvix found Rena in the campus commons area. She was eating something from the cafeteria that looked vaguely toxic and reading a datapad. "May I join you?" he asked, his structure cycling through colors that indicated polite request. "Sure." She gestured to the seat across from her. "Fair warning, I think this food might actually be trying to fight back. The cafeteria's human-compatible cuisine is something else." Kelvix settled into the seat, which adjusted automatically to his crystalline structure. "I wanted to thank you." "For what? Not killing you in the simulation?" She grinned. "That was kind of the point of the safety protocols. For teaching me something I should have learned years ago, that different doesn't mean lesser, and adaptation takes many forms. My people's intellectualism isn't superior to your people's survival skills. They're both valid responses to different circumstances." Rena considered this while battling with whatever the cafeteria had optimistically labeled as pasta. "You know, that's pretty enlightened for someone who was absolutely certain he was better than me about 3 hours ago. I was taught that civilization meant transcending violence. But perhaps true civilization means achieving peace despite violence, cooperation despite competition, philosophy despite the need for practical survival. Your species managed all of that while living on a planet that apparently wants you dead. Earth's not so bad once you know which parts are actively lethal and which parts are only potentially lethal." Rena stabbed at her food. "Besides, it makes vacations to other planets super relaxing. I went to this resort world last year where the biggest danger was sunburn. It was amazing. I got bored after 2 days, but it was amazing." Kelvix's structure flickered with what might have been amusement. "I suspect your species will have that effect on the galaxy, making everyone re-evaluate their assumptions while simultaneously terrifying them. As long as they're friendly about it, I'm good. Though I might need to have a talk with whoever did Earth's initial classification. Class 7 is really underselling it, and that seems like the kind of misunderstanding that could get someone hurt. I believe the Galactic Council is already having those discussions. Apparently, your species' casual attitude toward danger has caused multiple diplomatic incidents. In our defense, how were we supposed to know that other species find our planet scary? We live there. It's home. And that," Kelvix reflected, "was perhaps the most terrifying thing about humans. To them, their nightmare Deathworld was just home. They loved it, built civilizations on it, created art about it, and thought fondly of its many varied ways of potentially killing them. The galaxy had spent thousands of years developing theories about civilization, advancement, and sophistication, based on the experiences of species from gentle worlds. And then humanity had shown up, cheerfully surviving on a Class 11 nightmare planet while developing philosophy, art, science, and culture, casually demolishing the assumption that peaceful environments were necessary for advanced civilization. It was humbling. It was terrifying. It was, Kelvix had to admit, absolutely fascinating. "I'm glad you're here," he said finally. "The Institute needs more perspectives that challenge our assumptions." "Thanks. I'm glad I'm here too. Even if the cafeteria food is questionable, and half the students look at me like I'm going to bite them. To be fair, after today's demonstration, that fear is not entirely irrational." Rena laughed, and the sound was so genuine and unguarded that several nearby students looked over in surprise. Here was this human, this Deathworld survivor who had just casually dominated a Class 9 simulation, laughing over terrible cafeteria food and good-natured conversation. The galaxy, Kelvix thought, was going to have to make a lot of adjustments now that humanity had joined the community. Their presence would challenge assumptions, force reevaluations, and generally make everyone uncomfortable in ways that would ultimately lead to growth. And somewhere in the administrative offices, multiple departments were probably revising Earth's classification rating while simultaneously trying to figure out how to diplomatically tell humanity that their planet was actually terrifying and they maybe shouldn't be